So my name's Natasha Mauthner, and it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon, although it's evening for me because I'm based in the UK. To be running this workshop on the work of Karen Barad and what it might mean for qualitative research. Now, yesterday I ran this session as well, and it was a much bigger group, but it's quite nice today because there are fewer of us. And I wonder, because there are fewer of us, whether you'd actually like to introduce yourselves. And let me just get my slides up. I'll try and share my screen as well. Okay. Right, so share screen. Kelly, could you let me screen share?
Yes, one moment.
Thank you.
Okay, you should be good.
Okay, let me try that again. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, super. Yeah, so usually, well, usually if there's a small group like there is today, and if, you know, when I'm running workshops in person, obviously we go around the room and ask people to introduce themselves. And because it is quite a small group, I wonder whether everybody would be happy to do that, just to say a little bit about who you are and you know, what your academic position or role or institution and what your research is on and why you chose this workshop, just as a way of getting a bit of information about who's in the room. So can I just ask anybody to come forward? I can pick people.
I'll go first. Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisette Lorenz. I am a PhD candidate in Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. And I qualitatively research the connection between mental health and environmental health at the grassroots community level. So I'm working with nonprofit organizations and mental health clinics, and I do ethnographic research. And my interest in today's workshop is coming from the theoretical approach that I'm interested in, which is looking at radical relationality and how, if we have a quantum approach to mental health issues as opposed to the classical model, a whole different, these mental health conditions take on a whole different set of meanings. And it even questions, you know, what counts as mental illness. So I'm very excited for today's workshop.
Brilliant. Sounds amazing, Lisette. Thank you so much. Okay, does somebody else want to come forward?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, I guess I'll talk since nobody else is. My name's Scott. I actually, my research background is in religious studies, but I'm just taking on actually a master's right now in counseling psychology, with a particular interest in end-of-life care. And so my real interest in this sort of work too is that, like, in counseling and end-of-life care, there's a particular perspective of you're not going into a room with a sense of not knowing is probably the most essential aspect of providing good end-of-life care. And I think that the quantum model really provides a helpful theoretical structure of just understanding what happens in those types of encounters, which actually can be quite miraculous. And I won't say too much more, but I really like the framework of quantum theory to be able to kind of act as a container for the sorts of experiences that that happen all the time in a counseling session.
Thank you, Scott. That's really interesting. Okay, someone else want to come forward? I can't see hands up on my screen. So if you want to just go ahead, just do so. Wesley, hi.
How are you doing?
Good.
I'm Wes Widmeyer. I teach at the ANU in Australia. This morning, I think my research it's 4 a.m., so my research interest is coffee. But seriously, just trying to get going. But I'm really excited about this. My research interest is in political economy and macroeconomics, and I find quantum really interesting. Obviously, uncertainty is key to understanding the economy. Ideas like kind of superposition, the idea that we have kind of multiple overlapping interests. That's very Keynesian, animal spirits and all that. And entanglement is a very macro way of looking at the economy. And I find that even for myself, it's often still a challenge of imagination. That when I've talked to social theorists, it's very hard, and I don't want to come off as trying to adhere to orthodoxies or whatever. It's very hard to transcend when you're talking about economy, which is studied in such an atomized way, to think about it in a truly kind of relational, structural way. Because micro foundations are so baked into the way of thinking about it. So Barad's work is interesting to me, and it's just trying to come up with a way of talking about the economy in a truly relational way, and what that would mean, and how that might be an alternative to really getting at conventional economics from a real root and branch critique. But anyway, I'm really looking forward to it. The article is really interesting and stimulating, and yeah, so thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Wesley. So anybody else? I can see that Gabriel's feeling a bit under the weather, but thank you, Gabriel, for sharing a bit about your background and what you're doing and your interest in the workshop. Does anybody else want to come forward?
He's gonna go grab something. Okay. 1 moment. I'm gonna go get you some lunch, okay?
Okay. I think somebody's got their mic on. Okay. So, what we'll do is we'll get started, but I would welcome other people who are here today just to do what Gabriel did and just to share a few details on the chat. That would be great. And I know that some of you would have filled in a questionnaire that I pre-circulated before the workshop, so I know a little bit about some of the people who are here and some of the interests and so on. So let me just tell you a bit about the purpose of the workshop and what to expect. So there's going to be, as we've already heard, actually, there's a bunch of different disciplines and fields and interests that are in the room, and people are using different theoretical and methodological approaches in their research, and there's obviously also going to be different levels of familiarity with Barad's work. So some of you will be new to her ideas, and some of you might be working with these ideas already, and some of you might be quite skeptical. But I think what we all share is a sort of interest in Karen Barad and a commitment today to explore this work together, with a key focus on the methodological questions which are raised by the theory of agential realism. And I actually think that having a diverse group, different backgrounds, different interests, makes for a much more sort of interesting and stimulating discussion, and an opportunity to really learn a lot from each other. And I'm certainly looking forward to learning from you. But what it also means is that this workshop won't necessarily address everyone's questions and everyone's needs, but we're just dipping our toe in the water here in the time that we've got available. So think about this really as a bit of a taster session. And, you know, we're trying to create a community of practice through today's workshop, through the one that we had yesterday as well. And hopefully this will inspire, you know, some of you to keep going on your journeys of exploration and experimentation with Barad's ideas. So this is how I've structured the workshop, but because we're a relatively small group, we might actually change the structure a wee bit. So I'm going to say a little bit about who I am and my interest in Barad's work. I'll then give you a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of Barad's key ideas and concepts, and then look at how these ideas have been taken up in qualitative research. And then we'll look at 3 examples of how Barad's ideas have been used in practice in qualitative research. And then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to do group work. And what we did yesterday is we went into breakout rooms, but depending on how many of us are here, we might just actually consider just doing that together as one big group, in which case the kind of feedback and sharing will change a wee bit. But that's more or less kind of the structure that I had. So there is going to be quite a lot of talking from me, which I don't usually do, but I think we need to do that just to kind of get some basic ideas and concepts out there and understand, you know, what we're talking about. But then, as I said, there is this opportunity to have the group work and to do more of a discussion based and questions and so on. And of course, if you do have questions as I'm speaking, please just kind of open your mic and go ahead and ask questions. When I run these workshops, I like to just have a code of conduct, which is just a bit about how we're going to interact with one another. I'm not going to read this, but I'll just give you a couple of seconds just to kind of read through that and you know, agree on this. Okay. So let me just tell you a little bit about me and also my interest in Karen Barad. So I'm currently a professor of social science, philosophy and method at Newcastle University, and I did my undergraduate degree at Cambridge in the natural sciences. So I studied biology and psychology and history and philosophy of science. And then for my PhD, I went into a social and political science faculty, and drew on feminist psychology and sociology and worked very closely with a feminist psychologist called Carol Gilligan. And then she was actually sort of a visiting professor at Cambridge, which is how I got to know her and worked with her. And I was deeply influenced by her work at that point in my journey. And so I went to Harvard, which is where she was based, for postdoctoral fellowship to continue to work with her for a year. And then I returned to the UK, and since then I've held research and lecturing posts at the Universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Newcastle. And my approach in my research is very interdisciplinary. So I draw on feminist science studies and feminist epistemology, sociology, social research methodology, and other areas as well, and could use quite an eclectic approach. So that's sort of a bit about my background. And what I'm going to do now is just tell you a little bit about my own interest in Karen Barad and how I came, you know, how and why really I came to be so inspired by their work. I often find these, when I go to talks and I hear these kinds of journeys and stories, I find them very interesting and inspiring. So I thought I would share a bit about my own journey with you. So I did my PhD in the late 1980s, early 90s, and my PhD was actually on women's experiences of motherhood and postpartum depression. And it was very much rooted within what I call this feminist voice-giving project and identity politics movement that was very closely associated with second wave feminism. And as I said, I worked with Carol Gilligan, who's an influential second wave feminist thinker, and was influential at that time because she wrote a book in 1982 called In a Different Voice that some of you might have heard of, which was, you know, extremely revolutionary, changed many, many fields beyond psychology, which is the field within which it was situated. And then a decade later, she wrote a book with her former PhD student, Lynn Mickle-Brown, which was called Meeting at the Crossroads. And what that book was trying to do was to really develop a method to analyze interview narratives, a method that was relational and feminist and voice-centered. And it was very much about recognizing and listening to women's otherwise silenced and marginalized voices. So that was very much the tradition, if you like, that I was trained in. But at the same time, I was doing my PhD at a time when poststructural and postmodern discourses and debates were very, very strong, particularly in feminist epistemology. And all of these were really questioning the essentialism that was at the heart of second wave feminism and its voice-giving project. So I was really caught between this tension of, on the one hand, I was interviewing women and hearing these stories of depression and suffering and so on. And then on the other hand, I was reading that everything was socially constructed and there was no reality. And of course, I'm simplifying huge and complex debates here, but I just want to give you a sense of that kind of intellectual environment that, that I was situated in. And, you know, I've really sort of spent, in a sense, the rest of my career trying to make sense of and disentangle this central problematic and tension which arose for me in my own research, and which really, in the end, led me to give up empirical research for a decade in order to read more theoretical literature. And, you know, I was really searching for scholars and works that would help me address this kind of central problematic. And one day in February 2011, I sat down and I started reading Karen Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. And I started from the beginning with the preface and the acknowledgements section. And as I read the first few lines, I got goosebumps. And I knew that this is what I'd been looking for the past decade, because I felt this book was really speaking directly to this tension that I'd experienced as a researcher. And, you know, it seemed to provide an answer to that question that had been troubling me for such a long time. So this was really the beginning of a journey for me. And at this point, it was very much a theoretical journey in the sense that I found this book, you know, gave theoretical answers to what essentially was a philosophical problem at that point. And I'm going to say more about this later on when I go into more detail about Barad's work. But in a nutshell, Barad's concept of an agential reality, which I'll say more about, you know, a reality that dynamically and ongoingly makes and remakes itself, gave me a way through this kind of impasse between realism and social constructionism that had really brought my empirical research to a standstill. But of course, the question that then arose for me was, how do we put this philosophical approach into practice? Because although I took a break from empirical research, I was still committed to it. And so what I wanted to do was to take this philosophy of science and translate it into a research practice and method that I could take into the world to do empirical research. And this is really what most of my work has focused on. It's trying to develop a methodology and a method by systematically working through Karen Barad's philosophy of science to think through, well, what might it mean for empirical social research and qualitative research in particular? And my approach has been slow, very slow, and incremental, and it's involved a combination of studying and understanding and interpreting Barad's ideas and key concepts, and also drawing on other useful concepts, particularly in the works of Donna Haraway and Michel Foucault, and trying to develop a methodology and a method, and then really experimenting with these methodological practices by applying them to projects to see what works and what doesn't work. And I've done this on a number of projects, working on my own or with colleagues or PhD students, and in a number of different areas and different topics. So I've looked at gender inequalities in higher education and women's entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia, the impact of emerging technologies on work and family lives, and big data and data sharing in the social sciences. These are all projects which have kind of given me an excuse to try and see how to use Barad's ideas in practice. And I've also written about how Barad's ideas change our understanding of what research methods are and what they do, and also the implications of agential realism for how we conceptualize and practice research ethics. So those are the kind of areas that my work is focused on. And I have to say that after 12 years of working with Barad's ideas, I still go from days when I feel like I've cracked it to days when I feel like, I'm losing the plot and I'm going crackers, I'm confused, I'm lost. I struggle to pin down really how Barad's work changes research practice and methods. And I think that part of the problem is that it feels like it should be revolutionizing how we do research, because the theory itself and the quantum physics that underpin it are revolutionary. But in my experience, what it means in practice is something that feels both simple and incredibly profound. It's kind of partly tweaking what we do, but somehow those small tweaks seem to change everything. But holding those two things together can sometimes feel challenging. So I guess what I really want to emphasize today is that, like everyone else here, I'm still on this journey. And although I'm presenting, work to you that's based on what I've published, I still really feel that it's very much work in progress. And that fundamentally, I'm still doing a lot of problem solving and experimenting, which actually I enjoy. So that's a good thing. So that's just a bit about me and my interests. And if anybody wants to ask any questions at this point, please jump in. Otherwise, I'll move on. So I can't see anybody at this point jumping in. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just continue, and what I'm going to do is just give you a whistle-stop tour of some of Barad's key ideas and concepts. Again, as I said earlier, I know some of you will be really quite familiar with her work, and others perhaps don't know anything. So pitching it at the right level is tricky. So if you're familiar with all this, bear with me, and I'm going to look forward to really kind of, picking your own brains about how you understand Barad and what it means for research practice. So, and again, I should emphasize as well that this is very much my own interpretation of Barad's work. There are many different interpretations of her work and of what the key concepts that she uses, what they mean. So this is really just what I think. And, in fact, one of the things that I've done in my own work is to really highlight the fact that there are different interpretations of key concepts, particularly concepts like posthumanism, materiality, and relationality. And because I feel it's really important to be clear on the specific interpretations that we're drawing on, because one of the reasons why this field of kind of new materialist, posthumanist, quantum sort of studies can feel confusing, apart from the fact that the ideas themselves, can be difficult to grasp, is that there can sometimes be a lack of conceptual precision. So that's why I think it's really important to say exactly what we mean when we use a concept like relationality. There's lots of different ways of conceptualizing that. So how are we conceptualizing it exactly? So a key source of inspiration for Barad's work is the physicist Niels Bohr and his work and his interpretation of quantum experiments at the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular, the so-called double slit experiment, which shows that electrons display both wave and particle characteristics, what is called wave-particle duality, depending on how they're measured. So this discovery is what made it necessary to go beyond classical physics, which assumes that matter, is either wave or particle-like, but not both. And it really forms the cornerstone of quantum mechanics. So Niels Bohr interprets wave-particle duality as suggesting that physical entities like light, electrons, matter, don't have fixed properties prior to being measured. Rather, the nature of those entities is dependent on the experimental circumstances. So the double slit experiment demonstrates that the nature of the observed phenomenon changes with corresponding changes in the apparatus. And this is an extended quote from Barad, which I think is important in conveying this key idea. So Barad writes, the lesson that Bohr takes from quantum physics is very deep and profound. There aren't little things wandering aimlessly in the void that possess the complete set of properties that Newtonian physics assumes, like position and momentum. Rather, there's something fundamental about the nature of measurement interactions, such as given a particular measuring apparatus, certain properties become determinate while others are explicitly excluded. and which properties become determinate isn't governed by the desires or the will of the experimenter, but rather by the specificity of the experimental apparatus. So what's interesting is that, what Barad sees then in quantum physics experiments, and Bohr's interpretation of them in particular, is empirical evidence of the existence of a different metaphysics than the one underlying Newtonian mechanics. And so Barad's project really seeks to construct a new metaphysics, which is informed by quantum rather than classical physics, and that uses Bohr's philosophical insights as a point of departure for elaborating what Barad calls agential realist metaphysics and its underpinning of relational ontology. Now, Barad introduces this key concept of intra-action to conceptualize this relational ontology. And this is a key idea in their work, because what intra-action does is it signifies a relation of mutual constitution and ontological inseparability, in contrast to the concept of interaction, which we're more familiar with, which is essentially the coming together of two already pre-existing constituted entities. And drawing on Bohr's insights, what Barad suggests is that the objects that we study are not independent entities, but interactions between the measuring device and the entity that's being measured. And this is what Bohr calls, he uses the concept of the phenomenon to call this inseparable thing, to denote what that is. But what Barad argues is that these experiments in quantum physics tell us not only about the inseparability of the measuring device and the entities that it measures, but that these experiments actually reveal the fundamentally relational nature of reality. So for Barad, interactive relations of fundamental inseparability are actually what constitutes reality. They are matter. They are what the world is ontologically made of. And in Barad's understanding, though, it's important to emphasize and remember that matter is not a classical understanding. It's not a property of things, but it's a sort of a dynamic and shifting entanglement of relations. So that's the thing with Barad, is that the concepts that they use are always used in a different way through this metaphysics that they elaborate. So Barad therefore rejects the classical notion of matter and materiality as this natural kind of brute positivity of, or the essential givenness of things, and rather matter, materiality, relations, phenomena, entanglements, interaction, all to some extent interchangeable in Barad's metaphysics, are really understood as dynamic actions, doings, reconfigurings, and essentially as the world kind of unmaking and remaking itself. So this is a relational ontology in which matter and relations, in other words, the ontology of the world, are very much understood as intrinsically indeterminate, and they only come into being through these contingent and dynamic interactive processes of differentiation. And this is what Barad calls agential cuts. And these agential cuts are enacted through varied material discursive practices, another key concept. So in thinking about or developing this concept of material discursive practices, Barad is building very much on insights from post-structuralism, and particularly the work of Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, but moves away from post-structuralism's focus on discourse, which is understood primarily in linguistic terms. And Barad really reconceptualizes that relationship between discourse and materiality in non-dualistic terms. So materiality and discourse are understood as mutually constituted and articulated, in other words, interactive. This means that just as discursive practices, if you like, are always already material, so they're an ongoing materialization of the world, so too materiality is discursive. Material phenomena only come into being through discursive practices. They're inseparable from them. And it's these material discursive practices that unmake and remake the world. And they can be everything and anything from policies to institutions, regulations, technologies, discourses, scientific statements, philosophical propositions, moral frameworks, political regimes, legislation, and more. Now, I've argued as well that agential realism, it doesn't simply reject an essentialist ontology in favor of a relational one. It also insists on accounting for the politically consequential material discursive practices by which all relations and entities are brought into being. And it's in this respect, I think, that Barad's relational ontology can be characterized as posthumanist, another key concept that Barad uses, because following Barad, posthumanism is a practice of accounting for the boundary-making practices by which all entities are differentially delineated and defined. And this is why Barad insists that ethics is not separate from science, but inherent to its practice, and why Barad calls agential realism an ethico-onto-epistemology, where ethics, ontology, and epistemology are seen as inseparable. So the interesting thing then is that agential realism is actually a realist ontology, but it's where reality is always an agentially enacted ontological inseparability within the phenomenon. So agential realism, it seeks to move beyond the debate between realism and social constructionism, which is the sort of tension that I talked about earlier. And it does this by reclaiming a form of realism where entities, including the objects of our research, are real, but only to the extent that they're brought into being through ongoing interactions or material discursive practices, which include our own research practices and methods. So agential realism therefore provides what Barad calls the performative or non-representational ontology and epistemology, in which knowledge practices themselves play a part in bringing their objects of study into being. So following Barad, the focus of scientific investigation is really these wide-ranging material discursive practices that materialize the ontology of the world, including our objects of study, bring them into being as bounded entities with specific identities and meanings. So that's sort of the kind of theoretical, philosophical background, or some key concepts and key ideas that Barad uses, and so the outlines of the theory, if you like. And of course, the next question is really, well, what does this then mean for social research? And I think that Barad here does give us some resources, particularly the notion of a diffractive methodology, which as a means of putting agential realism into practice. And diffraction is a phenomenon in physics, but it's been taken up by Barad and also by Donna Haraway to replace reflection as a metaphor for thinking about what we do in research or when we produce knowledge. So what diffraction refers to is the way in which waves change direction as they encounter or bend around an obstacle or pass through an opening. And the concept of diffraction can be tricky to get our head around. So in a piece I wrote recently, I described it as like a cloud's silver lining, which is when sunlight bends around the edge of the cloud and there's a bright outline that occurs where light is diffracted by cloud droplets along the cloud's outer edge. And so using a diffractive methodology means that our research doesn't discover or reflect the true nature of the social world, but it's really the result of multiple interactions, including interactions between our research practices and the issues that we study, just as the silver lining is the effect of an interaction between light and cloud. So what Barad writes is that a diffractive methodology requires a way of understanding the world from within and as part of it. So again, what does this mean? How do we do this? Well, let's look at how Barad's ideas, including this diffractive methodology, have been taken up in qualitative research. If we look at empirical studies that are using Barad's ideas, there is agreement that their work implies a whole new relational way of thinking about what we study and how we study it. And it really calls into question many of the concepts and the practices that we use in qualitative research. So, for example, individual agency, intentionality, subjectivity, subject-object dichotomies, research ethics, and much more. But there are many different interpretations of what this then means for research practice. And what I put here on this slide is kind of some broad trends and some broad areas of work. It is actually there is now a huge literature on this. So one of the things that you find is that researchers will often use a Baradian theoretical framework and concepts, but then the research itself tends to use conventional humanist qualitative methods and approaches. So there can be a problem of lack of translation. Well, how does the theory then translate into different practices? What we also see is that the concepts of interaction and entanglement are used quite frequently in qualitative research, and they're really used to conceptualize relations between researchers and research participants, and or to suggest that the social world is complex and in a state of flux and change. So that's another kind of interpretation and approach. Some people find that the emphasis on materiality is an important and attractive aspect of Barad's theory, and has inspired researchers to look at the material dimensions of research. And that can be human bodies and bodily experiences and emotions of both researchers and research participants. It can also mean attention to the environmental setting of the research and the physical objects of the research. So whether that's noise, architecture, IT, furniture, and so on. And then some people have looked at the research devices and tools like recording devices and the impact of that materiality on the research. Then there's another body of work, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which is called post-qualitative inquiry. And what that does is it really critiques qualitative research concepts and methods. So, for example, concepts like voice, experience, and narrative, and then also methods like interviews, ethnography, reflexivity, and so on. And in fact, some researchers even suggest, we need to get rid of methods altogether and not use research methods in our research and do research in a completely different way, use concepts as methods. And then there's also been an uptake of this concept of diffraction. So for some people, that means diffractive readings, which means reading text through one another. Other people do what they call diffractive data analysis, and that means using different theoretical approaches to look at the difference it makes to the analysis of data and different findings. And for other researchers, diffraction is kind of used in a similar way to how reflexivity would be used, so a positioning of the researcher within the research. So that just gives you a kind of flavor of some of the different ways in which researchers are really trying to put this into practice. But what I thought it would be useful to do before we kind of, have a group discussion is to just take you through 3 examples. And obviously, I'm going to give you the references to these papers at the end of the presentation. And I'm just kind of skimming the surface here of this work, and it's worth reading them in much more detail and more depth. So the first one is a study by Zabrodska, which was looking at academic bullying and used a diffractive methodology as well as the concept of interaction. So what these researchers have done is rather than treat bullying and bullies and victims as pre-existing entities, what they're really interested in understanding is how bullying, the phenomenon of bullying, is performatively accomplished and made real. And this includes examining how academic bullying is interactively constituted with neoliberal discourse and its approach to management. And they also used a method of what they call collective biography and used it in a diffractive way. So what they did is there were 7 academics who wrote and shared with each other and rewrote biographies of academic bullying, which they located within specific kind of political and cultural contexts. And they didn't view these stories as accurate reflections of the nature of bullying in academia, which would be that kind of representational understanding which Barad is working against. But rather they saw these stories as the result of interactive forces, including the bully, the victim, neoliberal reforms, excessive workloads, micromanagement, unrealistic expectations on staff, responsibilization, the bodies and emotions of the storytellers, university reporting mechanisms, and so on. And so through their analysis, they use their analysis to really question these conventional definitions of bullying and this one-way kind of power structure with the powerful bully exerting influence on the powerless victim. And they argue that understanding bullying through a Baradian framework really shifts our attention away from individual entities, bullies, victims, bystanders, universities, to understand it as the result of these diverse forces which are interacting with one another. And I think from what some of you said in when you introduced your own research, that's probably quite similar to, from what I could gather, to what some of you are trying to do as well. The second example is from a study of, it's actually a study of maternal care in Nigeria. Two researchers, Mann and Wolgamuth, used a qualitative secondary data set. So they analyzed transcripts from 3 focus groups taken from a larger study. And these focus groups were carried out with healthcare workers, with traditional birth attendants, and with mothers to explore postnatal care. What they were specifically interested in is the material discursive dimensions of the research process, which for then includes the research decisions that are made, but also the research materials that are used, the research settings, and so on. And their argument is that research participants' accounts, their identities, their knowledge, their lives are not out there waiting to be discovered, but rather they're produced through these material discursive arrangements of the research. So I'm just going to give you one example of that. There's many more examples they discuss in their article, but just to kind of give you a flavor of what this looks like, what they did is they actually explored the material arrangements of the focus groups that took place. And what they argue is that those material arrangements made some subject performances more likely than others. And so they're analyzing, if you like, the potential effect of the materiality of the hospital, particularly on the traditional birth attendants. So the traditional birth attendants are healthcare providers who are looking after women and maternal care, but not as in traditional healthcare workers. They're these kind of more community-based, if you like, workers. And so what they argue is that these traditional birth attendants might have experienced the hospital setting as an unfamiliar and hostile environment, and one that doesn't value their skills and experiences and expertise, and that this may have led to the traditional birth attendants really enacting what they call defensive identities and experiences, and sort of personas, if you like, and accounts. And they argue that if the focus groups had been conducted in a different setting, so for example, in the community setting that the traditional birth attendants are more familiar with, then perhaps the traditional birth attendants and the other participants may have had access to other identities and performances. So the results of the focus group, they argue, are therefore interdependent with and dependent on the material discursive conditions of the research, and specifically how and where the focus groups were set up. So that's the second example. And I'll just give you the third example now, which I've drawn from my own research. So my own work, as I mentioned earlier, it has been around trying to develop a methodology and a method, and specifically a method which I've called diffractive genealogy, to study how I've used it in a different range of studies, but here I'm going to just give you an example of using this in a study of how families negotiate emerging technologies. So what I take from Barad's work is this idea that the boundaries and the borders that structure and configure the world that we live in are not fixed, given, or self-evident. And so really the purpose of our research is to show this, to show the differential political and other impacts of existing configurations, and to propose other possible ways of organizing ourselves that can literally bring into being a different world, bring a different world into existence. So that's one idea. And then the other idea is that our research interacts with what we study, and that as researchers, we're therefore responsible for the role that our own research practices play in making the world what it is and the world that we study, and that we have to account for this in our research. So I draw on Barad's diffractive methodology, which is a very helpful concept, but the other concept I use, which is in Barad's work but hasn't really been very much picked up, is the concept of genealogy. And genealogy is really a kind of conceptual and methodological approach that's been used extensively by Michel Foucault. And I think it gives us a way of studying interactions and material discursive practices at different scales, and to understand how these constitute our object of study. So I tried to put some of these ideas together on this slide to try and explain what I mean here. On the left, we've got the genealogy part, which has got all of those material discursive practices that are involved in constituting the object of study. And then, I see empirical research, but it can be qualitative or quantitative, as in a sense, part of that genealogy. We can do empirical research as part of the process of trying to understand the phenomenon that we're studying and the multiple kind of threads and entangled parts of this object. And on the right-hand side, I've put diffraction, which my reading of diffraction is it's about accounting for not only our own research practices, which is the bottom yellow, part of the circle, the lower circle, but kind of the broader social science apparatus that this is part of. And these material discursive practices, can be all the different things I mentioned earlier, institutions, legislation, regulations, policies, and so on. And the phenomenon that we're studying is kind of the whole thing. And it's the interaction between the red and the yellow, which produces the orange, which produces this object of study. But what we're actually studying is the whole thing. And what I've done as well on the slide is just to try and illustrate what does that look like then in terms of this project that we've been working on, which is looking at families negotiating emerging technologies. We've got in the red on the left-hand side, all the different practices, material discursive practices, different scales that are going into constituting this phenomenon. We also did a qualitative study of 3 families using visual, creative, observational, interview methods. And that's all part of us trying to understand and map the genealogy of the phenomenon of the interactions between families and technologies. And then on the right-hand side is kind of our own approach to the research, the methods, that we're using, but understood in a performative, not in a representational way. And similarly, our respondent accounts and practices we're also understanding in this performative, in these performative terms and not representational terms. And that, of course, is a product of working within a specific philosophical perspective, which is, agential realist. But that itself is also part of a larger kind of social science apparatus, if you like. And so part of that piece is, we studied in depth kind of theoretical conceptualizations of the relationship between technology and social change. So as I said earlier, for me, this is still very much work in progress and trying to kind of understand how we put this into practice. And as I said, very much experimenting with different ways of doing this to see where that takes us. So what I would just say, trying to kind of bring some of these ideas together, is that, there isn't a unified approach or a single correct interpretation of Barad's work and how to use it in qualitative research. And we see that because we see so many different examples of how this is being done. The other thing is that there isn't a methodological blueprint and there isn't a ready-made method. And I think actually that's what makes this area really exciting, because there's a lot of really exciting work going on. There's a lot of experimental work, and of course there's a lot of potential to innovate. And I'm sure that some of you here today, that's exactly what you're doing. So that's really my kind of take on some of this, some of my ideas, some of where I'm at with this. And I think what would be really nice to do now is to just have a discussion really with you all. And because there's not that many of us, I just wonder whether we could just have this discussion amongst ourselves. But of course, before I do that, I should just say, yes, if you have any questions at this point, please come forward. And that, in fact, yesterday when we had the question session, it was really good. It then triggered a discussion, a broader discussion, which was very, very interesting. So if I can invite you to come forward with questions or thoughts or contributions, or I'd love to hear, having kind of gone through this material, I'd love to hear more from you about, are you doing something similar? Are you doing something radically different? Are you combining some of these approaches? It would be very interesting for me to find out more about how you're tackling some of these issues and questions. Actually, if I stop sharing, I can see you all. Right. So would you like to? Okay, so we've got Gabriel. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding, but is this a form of interpretive methods or something entirely different? I was somewhat confused by the label post-qualitative. That's new to me. Okay, Gabriel, thank you for that question. It is different to interpretive methods because it's this concept of performativity that I think makes it very different, which is the idea that when we use, so if we, interpretive methods, let's say it's about meaning making and understanding people's meaning making and interviewing people, for example, and understanding those meaning making processes, which is what we would call a kind of representational way of understanding what the interview is doing and also what those accounts are. They're representing pre-existing or subjective experiences and meanings, or co-constructing them with the researcher. But I think this is a very different way of working because it's trying to get away from that representational idea. The label post-qualitative is used to, you should go and look at it. There might be something useful for you there. It's really trying to think about what does qualitative research look like within a post-humanist, post-structuralist, new materialist framework. So beyond, in a sense, some, moving on from interpretivism, moving on to some extent from social constructionism, although it's related to it, but thinking about how do we do research in this moment after those traditions. And the moment after those traditions is this kind of post-humanist, new materialist kinds of ideas, and these quantum ideas as well, because that's part of Barad's work. So that's really partly what that's trying to do. But when we use these terms like post-qualitative, a bit like when we use the term qualitative research, it's not a homogeneous category. There's actually so many different things going on in there, and post-qualitative researchers are using Barad's ideas, but they're also using people like Jane Bennett and Deleuze and Guattari and lots of other scholars as well. So it's also in itself quite a heterogeneous bundle of approaches and methods and theories. Okay, great. I'm glad that was helpful. So yes, please, I'd love to hear more about, yes, Scott.
Hello, I guess I'll just share an experience I've had that I think is related to this. I had the good fortune of getting a research grant in my undergrad in my third year, and I chose to do it on the kind of the experience of people with a religious faith in academia, so who are working as professors in the academic realm. And I wanted to take a phenomenological approach, but in all the literature I found, nobody could really tell you how to do phenomenology. I was like, I'm there, I want to do the research. What do I do? What do I do? And I looked, and it wasn't very helpful for me to just say like, well, you just bracket off all your ideas, right? Bing, bang, boom. So I cast my net a little wider, and And I found like a lot more help in field psychology. So I mentioned in the last session that in Jungian psychology, sorry, it's noisy here, I'm outside working. There's this idea of the analytic third, and it's this way of listening called reverie, in which you're both listening to a person as they're speaking, but you're also paying attention to how your mind is wandering. And the idea is that any ideas that come to you are a co-creation of that analytic encounter. And so if you're not paying attention to your own thoughts, even though they might seem unrelated, you're missing a key part of what's being communicated, right? And so I found, that's something you can do. That's something concrete you can do in an interview situation, is pay attention to what ideas, thoughts, songs, images, anything that emerge in an interview session. And so I got to create this whole methodology around that. The first part of it was I asked my participants to just provide me with whatever really influential materials like were in their life, both in their academic and religious life. And then I became familiar with those and then brought my research questions to that material and then created the interview from that material itself. And I thought about really as this process of entanglement. You know, I was looking at it through a quantum methodology. In the end, I didn't express that in my paper. I was looking at it through like indigenous research practices because I wasn't aware of Barad at that time, and it seemed just too much of a mountain to climb to frame it through the quantum lens. But I see a lot of relationship there in any case.
So you're just kind of fairly new to Barad's ideas and trying to see how that fits with what you've done, because you've identified some key ideas and concepts that seem to speak to how you've designed your method and what you've been doing in your own research. Is that right?
That's exactly.
Yeah, super. That's very, very interesting. And so how far down that journey are you? Are you finding that there's close connections? Are you finding Barad's work very useful for that? Is it taking you in a new direction beyond what you've already done?
You know what I'm finding is that, like, as I was trying to express what this research is about, I was looking for frameworks that were a good way of communicating it. So there's indigenous frameworks, which seem the most straightforward and the most natural language. And then there was, I don't know, there were some elements of post-structuralism in there, and there were some elements of second-order cybernetics, you know, and there was all these means of describing it. But I feel like now that I'm getting more familiar with Barad, it's one of the most eloquent and digestible ways of expressing this means of being in the world, you know, where we really do believe that it's about relationship and not ontologies, you know. Indigenous frameworks are great, but I'm not indigenous, you know. It's difficult for me to speak from that perspective. Whereas I think Barad is something that's really digestible to the academic community as a whole. So that's where I think it may be.
Thank you, Scott. It's really interesting. So other thoughts, questions, ideas? I'm just going to put in the chat, these are the if we were in smaller groups, but I don't think we need to do this. Oh, hold on, there's a question here. As a sociologist, I hope to approach every agency as an interconnected and interrelated quantum phenomenon to be deconstructed and reconstructed. Well, that sounds very interesting. Thank you for that. I'd love to hear more about how you're actually doing that. You know, are you doing that? Are you doing empirical research? And so how do you do that in your empirical study? You know, what does that look like in practice? What kind of methods do you use to do that? Do you need new methods? Can you use existing methods? Are you reconceptualizing methods? You know, those I think are some interesting questions. Is how do we, you know, that's certainly the question I'm interested in, is, you know, how do we kind of take that theory and put it into practice, and what are the different ways in which we can do that? So if you'd like to tell us more about that, that would be really interesting for us. So I'm just going to put in the chat questions that are the questions that are for the group work, which is essentially what we're doing now. So it's around why, yes, how people are using Barad's ideas, or if you're not using them already, how you're thinking you might want to use them. Why these ideas matter for research methodology, how it can change the direction of our research. But I think also, what are the challenges and the questions that we're facing? Because I think this can be challenging work, and I'm certainly interested to hear about some of the opportunities and challenges and questions that others are facing in trying to do this work. Lisette, do you want to tell us a bit more about?
Yeah.
Your work is really, really interesting. So I would love to hear more.
Sure. So I'm currently working on my dissertation, and something that I find fascinating, exciting, and also a little bit frustrating is that I'm working with an advisor who I'd say is still pretty much in the classical realm of doing research. And so she keeps asking for my literature review and methods section first. And I feel like every day the dissertation is different because it lives in the undifferentiated void of infinite potential. And every single day that passes, the final product is going to be different. And so I want to work in the middle, more like a grounded theory approach, I suppose, which is to say, I want to do the stuff first, interactively with all of my actors, and many of those actors are non-human. Many of those actors are not even what you would call real in the sense of sometimes I work with fiction, like science fiction, and sometimes I work with dreams, and dreams are just a phenomenologically different thing than the actors in the waking world. And I'll also say I work with not just Barad's ideas, but also I do look at indigenous wisdom and knowledge, and also Eastern contemplative practices, basically any form of radical relationality that goes beyond and against Newtonian Cartesian dualisms of mind-body. And so, yeah, I don't know. I keep avoiding writing the introduction and the methods section because I feel like that's not going to manifest until all the empirical work is done. So that's where I'm at. And I'll say my empirical work is also quite experimental, in part autoethnographic. So I feel comfortable disclosing that part of the reason why I look at the connection between mental health and environmental health in a community-based context is because I myself have been diagnosed with mental health conditions. And so I am very much in and a part of the community that I'm doing research in. And a lot of the content that we are dealing with has been labeled pathological and psychotic, which makes sense from a classical perspective of the mind and its relationship to reality. But if we take a quantum approach or a just a non-dualistic approach of mind and body, then all of a sudden, all of these phenomenological experiences that patients have are no longer pathological. They just speak to a different reality that is not separate from the classical one, but just is different and needs to be understood in using a different framework. So yeah, I mean, I'm deep in the middle of my field work. I probably have another 6 months left before I put everything together and join the empirics with the theories and the methods. But yeah, I don't know.
So when you say you're deep into the empirical, and you've mentioned autoethnography, but what else does that look like? What for you in your project? What else is that looking like, the empirical part?
So I am a peer health specialist, and I work with other folks who have mental health diagnoses, and we just kind of live our lives, support each other, talk about the experiences that we've had, work on different projects, different initiatives, and in that sense, it seems like a straightforward ethnographic project. But then in other ways, I want to put those experiences in conversation with other empirical sources. And I don't know, for example, there's one project, a group of us are looking at gardening as therapy. And what is it about gardening that can help our mental health conditions, and maybe even help us reframe what our conditions are? Working in the garden now means that we have a whole host of relations and actors, like the plants and animals and the soil themselves. They are now a part of this story. And we're trying to figure out, well, how do you interview plants? What does that mean to incorporate plants and animals and ecological relations into the story that we're trying to tell about mental health? Well, all of a sudden, it doesn't just feel like individual minds that are sick or broken. Now we feel like our minds are somehow embedded, spread out, shared with a larger sense of self that goes beyond each individual human being. But how do we write about that? How do we theorize around that? That's what we're trying to figure out.
Thank you so much, Lisette. It sounds like a fantastic study.
Thank you. It's a mess, but we'll see.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, won't it, to see how you narrate it. That's the thing. It's just how you, and when we narrate, we're often forced into that kind of more linear way of thinking. Although there is an interesting paper, you may have come across it, by Barad, I think it was 2014, which is where she experiments with a different way of writing, which tries to get away from that linearity. It's a paper on time, and she uses the work of Derrida a lot, and I think it's 2014, and I think it's called something like Diffracting Together Apart, something like that. Yeah, but check that out, because it might inspire you in terms of, she's trying to the paper is about time, so when she's writing the paper, she's trying to write it in such a way that the writing disrupts that linear time of reading a paper from beginning to end, if you see what I mean. So it's kind of really, really going back and forth between time, and it's trying to kind of, I suppose, write in an interactive way, like putting it into practice. But it was quite inspiring just to sort of see a different way of trying to do this, a way like that's because that's what I'm interested in, is always, well, how do we enact this different philosophical worldview? How do we, because we so easily fall back into the old ways because they're right there, we've learnt them, like we're steeped in them, so that's why that paper was good, because it was like, oh, here's a different way of writing which can open up possibilities as well. So that might be something that is useful for you.
Thank you. I will definitely check that out.
Great, thank you. So a couple of new people have joined us. So just to oh, good, Galeb has got their hand up.
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Sorry for the background noise. So my name is Galeb, and I'm a PhD student in sociology, and I'm working on my dissertation, doing field work, starting to write. And well, first I should say I actually I've never read Barad's work, so this is like an awesome introduction. But some of the conversations, it sounds like they're engaged with are to what I'm thinking of. And excuse me for bringing in other authors, but since that's all I have, one text I'm really engaging with is Eduardo Cohn's book called How Forests Think. And he talks about how he doesn't call the book How We Think Forests Think. It's How Forests Think. And I'm trying, so in my research is about fire, and specifically it's an ethnographic study of land managers. I'm in California. Land managers from indigenous tribes, from governmental agencies, from nonprofits who steward land through the active use of fire, specifically through burning. And I'm trying to understand in that process, bear with me. It's interesting. It's part of a bigger discussion of, what is fire? Is fire bad and destructive? Is fire good and regenerative? When is it either one? And I'm really trying to take up the question, look at it as, essentially fire is, if it's inseparable from us in many ways, right? If we dissolve the distinction between the person setting the fire and the fire itself and look at them as interconnected, then it's in many ways we're making that together. And there's something, I can give a little anecdote that always comes back to me when I think of this is, I was talking to a firefighter, interviewing a firefighter, and I was telling him, what, throughout your career have you learned about fire now that you've been around it a lot? And he said something like, it's so like fickle and untrustworthy, and it's like pernicious or something like that. And when he started, I was following up on that, and he was talking about how, because when you're burning, a big tactic is, you create what's called a control line around where you want to burn so the fire can't escape. And so he was talking about how, they had to sit on this fire for several days to make sure it wouldn't go beyond these lines. And so that, but he said inevitably it did. It burned under this line that they had created, and, burned a tree, a stump on the other side, which is incredibly common in burning. But it was interesting. I mean, very simply, when I hear that, I think, well, of course, if you put a line and fire crosses it, then you're going to say, damn you don't abide by my lines. But if you don't have that whole infrastructure of thinking about how, when I burn, fire needs to stay contained within this area, and it shouldn't go across this line, it shouldn't go into this ecosystem, then of course it's gonna be wild and uncontrollable. So that's, yeah, so I guess I'm but then when I think of that, I think, well, I guess what I'm saying is we make fire wild or not. But then I don't know if that just kind of falls back to a social constructionist kind of approach. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that was interesting, and that last question, I think, is a good one, isn't it? It's like you're trying to do something different, but it's very hard not to get sucked back in to those existing frameworks. As I said earlier, they're sort of everywhere. But I guess one when you were speaking, so one question I was interested in, because you said you're new to Barad's ideas, and so from what you've heard, did some things jump out at you and leap out, and you thought, gosh, yes, that sounds like an interesting idea that seems to fit with what I'm trying to do or trying to say? And has it made you think, I'd like to go and read more about this or this or this part of that work, because it's kind of resonating with what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, I think when you described intra-action versus interaction, and that sounds like something I'm kind of seeing that idea coming up in different literatures and debates, like, are there things that are there and then they come into relationship, or are they, constituted, I don't know what the word is, continually, or, however we talk about that. But that's definitely something I think I want to explore more, because, again, go back to the empirical example, like, it's a question of, is fire this inherently bad, wild, destructive thing? And so we're always trying to figure out how to engage with it. Or is its whole existence coming in through, coming about through the ways that we interact with it?
Yeah, I was thinking that when you were talking earlier, when you had this question, well, what is fire? And it's inseparable from us, and we make it together. That and what you've just said there as well, that, from a Baradian perspective, there is no such thing as what is fire intrinsically. It's made and remade differently all the time in those interactions. So it isn't a thing, is it? It isn't a one thing. It isn't that's so I think that, yeah, I think from what you're saying, what you're doing, I certainly hear some real kind of resonances there, and I can imagine you're going to find Barad's work really quite useful to help think through those questions, because in a way it helps us ask a different question. And I think that, come at it from a completely different angle, so that which is liberating, because that question, what is fire? Is it good? Is it bad? Like, in simple terms, that takes you kind of nowhere, in a sense, because it's all relational. It's all context dependent, isn't it? So that's where I think you might find something really quite fruitful there to help with that thinking. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we have Meryl Dermus has posted in the chat. New methods should be pursued, especially in the qualitative study of societal agency, intentionality, and performativity, and concepts closely in relation to these. The phenomena of collective memory and common sense should be reapproached from the quantum mechanics perspectives. Methods challenging even the post-qualitative methods should be experimented with. Yes, I agree with that. If consciousness is to be understood as a manifestation of quantum physics working in society. I'm new to Barad's ideas, but I'm interested in helping it shape my future research. Thank you so much for that really interesting comment there. There's clearly a lot of interesting work that you're all doing. And yeah, I'm very pleased that some of you are new to Barad and might leave this workshop inspired to go and read more and see how it connects. Scott.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to offer a quick comment or maybe an ongoing theme that I'm finding in this workshop is I really appreciated when you mentioned Barad's that paper on time, right? And just choosing a different style of writing to communicate something that she's trying to communicating, right? It's like this meta level of the communication itself that's targeted, you know? So one of my favorite Indigenous scholars is Sean Wilson. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he had the same struggle as other people were having, is that there was these real kind of rigid expectations within the academic sphere that didn't fit with his Indigenous epistemologies, you know, or ontologies or ethics. That was essentially relational and kind of it went backwards. You know, you don't start with a hypothesis. You are being changed. All your ideas are being changed as your research unfolds, you know, and you cannot make sense of it alone because it is being done with everybody else and everything else that you're engaging with. And so after he had done his work, the second problem he had was how to communicate it in a way that like maintains this relational accountability. And so what he ended up doing was he wrote it as a series of letters to his sons. He said, this is the best thing I could come up with, you know, is that, you know, knowledge isn't just out there as its own thing, right? It's always relational. Information is always communicated from me to somebody else. I need to have a voice that I'm speaking to. So he wrote it to his sons, you know, and I thought that was a really nice creative way of approaching it, and also an open-ended way. He didn't know how it was going to go, and I think that's something that makes a lot of academics uncomfortable, right? Is that seems like science. Like you might know the results, but you should know damn well what you're doing at all times, you know? And so I think this like making space for creativity, you know, within the academic sphere is just so important and like a real steep hill to climb in a lot of cases, but finding those spaces where you, even if you can inject a little bit of your own creativity into it, I think that can be really profound in not only the research, how it's understood, but the insights that come out of that research.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. That's so interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's as you say, it is an uphill struggle because so many of the systems that are in place are working against that kind of creativity. And you know, the way, you know, the expectations of journals, or, you know, even often if you're doing a PhD, you know, there are certain hoops that people have to get through that can constrain those opportunities to be creative and to step outside of those norms. So I think it's a really important part of trying to, in a sense, maintain the integrity of this way of working, which is carrying it through those different stages, as we're discussing now, right through to the writing, the presentation of the ideas, the communication of those ideas. And we need more examples. So I'm going to look up Sean Wilson, because that's a very inspiring, sounds like it's a very inspiring example there of trying to do something different. So thank you for that, Scott. So yeah, we're just for those of you who perhaps joined a bit later, we're just discussing different ways in which Barad's work is inspiring new thoughts, new directions for us. And yeah, what that might mean for methodology. And I think part of what we're saying is, you know, we really have to kind of reinvent to some extent methodology and methods. So yeah, any other questions or comments, contributions? Anybody want to share a bit more? Derek. Hi, Derek.
Yes, I do have some question. I'm very, very interested in the methodology aspect of how do you use Barad to go further. And there are items. She has very clear, clean concepts that you can put together for any research. I mean, the agent soul is clearly one aspect. What is to be an agent? And of course, anything can be an agent, not just you. There is also this idea of, how should I put it? The whole question of removing all subjects, very key. So all subjects and objects. I mean, removing that distinction. So that's a second area that you could use in different kind of research. The correlated one, but different yet, it would be interiority and exteriority. Interiority, exteriority, within and without, both of them being significant. Causality, which is not valid in classical physics, according to her, but is fine once you got into a cut. The whole idea of the cut itself. These are all sections of her thoughts which converge because it creates a world. It creates an yeah. Well, I sort of no. It's not so much that it creates a world. I still compare it to dream, and I think dream may be an okay comparison, but it can also be misleading. So I'm not sure I would use it very further, but it is something like it. Today I listened to the talk by what was his name? Hoffman. And Hoffman was inspired by Barad, it was clear. And I thought, but it's interesting. He was not interested in dream. He didn't seem to be interested in dream. Why isn't anyone interested in the fact that we are capable in our sleep in creating a universe in which we are completely persuaded that it's it? I don't understand why people don't recognize this incredible thing about the fact that we can believe every aspect of it, in spite of its insanity. So what I'm saying, it's a illogical way of being. So what Barad is saying is absolutely clear. She is giving us the intuition that we do make cuts. We don't realize we do make cuts in reality, but we do. We enter into it. We move out of it also. You are in a familiar environment. You go from one place to the other in the city, and everything is fine. There is continuity from the point you started to the point you got, but there are some times where you are not very attentive, so that you've cut the cut. You've lost that particular segment for that while, but it comes back. And the reason why we never doubt it is because it comes back the way we expected. But what if you actually translate all of that experience into the creativity that dreams actually give you quite naturally? So these are various things that I find fascinating. I think her sense of causality is fascinating. I think the whole idea of refusing representationalism is fundamental. On the other hand, I would say we cannot abandon it. We cannot refuse the fact that we have been prisoners of representationalism for very good reason, and it has given us a lot. But now that we have overcome it in a certain way, that's another angle from which one can grab a methodology. Refuse representationalism and finding immediately something to replace it, because if you do without it, I mean, it's very nice to say you can't use words for things, and you can't thing guys, you can not thinging, things. You have to be careful. But at the same time, when you lose representationalism, you lose a very big handle on what we call reality. So what do you think about that? How is your approach for a methodology using Barad? I mean, you've said a few things about it, but how do you feel? What did it give you so far?
Well, I think so. You probably missed this because I know you've had to join a bit later.
Yes, I had to.
So when I sort of did a presentation earlier, I talked about a method that I'm trying to develop. I mean, a method and a methodology, which is called a diffractive genealogy, which brings together Barad's concept of diffraction, and also Foucault's concept of genealogy, although that concept is embedded within Barad's work. It's just not been taken up. So my approach is I'm trying to develop a method that enables us to study a world that is relational in that sort of interactive sense, where everything is connected. So that's where the genealogy comes in, because that's a method that can help you to do that. But the diffractive part is, for me, a key aspect of Barad's project, a key kind of ethical and political aspect, and very much the piece around the fact that Barad's work comes out of as well feminist science studies and feminist epistemology, and Donna Haraway's work, which is this continual attempt to rethink objectivity. And so diffraction is one concept that has come through to help us rethink objectivity, that is in my view very closely connected to Donna Haraway's situated knowledges. So I'm trying to put these two things together to kind of come up with a method and a methodology that is genealogical, but that also accounts for the genealogy that it produces, and that's where the kind of diffractive piece comes in. So that's what I'm sort of experimenting with. I mean, I've been working on this for 12 years. So it's, you know, I've kind of come up with various things and just trial and error and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and experimenting within different projects. And yeah, I mean, I as I said in my talk, I know you missed it, but you know, there are some days when I think I'm making real progress here, and then there are other days when I think I'm not sure I've made any progress. You know, it's a very elusive. Some of these ideas are very powerful and convincing, and I'm totally kind of committed to them, but it's also sometimes feels quite elusive. And I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday as well. You know, Derek, you were there, and you made that really helpful kind of contribution of, you know, how do we convey the significance, the kind of earth-shattering significance of this to other people in a sort of accessible way? And that's the question, ongoing question for me, certainly. And it's the same with the kind of methodological implications. How do we communicate and convey that this has to entail a really different way, not only of doing research, but of conceptualizing what it is we think we're actually doing when we do research. Yeah. So that's I think where there are a lot of kind of, you know, a lot of question marks and work to be done. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Barad themselves kind of says in the book, and also I went to a conference, a small conference, where they were speaking a few years ago, and Barad said, you know, well, I myself often get caught out or get sucked back into these kind of, you know, these ways of thinking that are so deeply ingrained in everything we do and how we organize ourselves, you know.
Ontologies.
Yes. Yeah.
She actually, I saw that somewhere where she confessed that she had been trapped by an ontology that wasn't there. But did you hear this morning, Kathy talking about not being cynical about being able to change the world, and Alex rushing to say, hold it, I believe that one can change the world. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I missed that. I wasn't at that talk.
Oh, it was really fun. She did a fantastic presentation, and she made things extremely clear. I mean, she used music in a very intelligent way, but at some point at the end, somebody asked her whether she thought that quantum physics and eventually coming to an understanding of what really it entails, would he be able to change the world? And she responded, oh God, we've been doing that forever and never done this thing. And our education system is so stupid, it'll never get there. And Alex had just jumped right in and said, no, I believe we can change the world. And I kind of like that. This is why I'm so interested in how you convey these things.
Yes.
And funny, I had never thought about music before as one of the arts that would actually be pertinent and relevant to quantum physics. And she didn't make the connection scientific. She made it much more metaphoric, but it was really very good. And it was, since I am looking for arts, really am, I think arts is part of the solution in some ways. So I thought it was great. Another way of looking at it is I have both studied and loathed semiotics. I really hated it, but I studied it. And the reason I hated it was using concepts, really just concepts, in order to translate reality into, they try to make a sort of a Wittgenstein mathematics of signification. And I don't think it gave us much. What I fear, if we take Barad on her word and make a sort of a method out of it, we might risk the same thing. What do you think?
Yes, I can see why you're saying that. It's a tricky one, isn't it? It's systematizing something that can't be systematized. Yeah. On the other hand, you know, one needs a way of a way in.
Oh yes,
you know,
absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a bit like you know, I didn't train as an anthropologist, but there was a point when I read a lot of studies in anthropology and ethnography, a lot of around methods, because that's my sort of interest. And I remember reading someone's account saying, you know, well, in anthropology, you know, somebody just your supervisor just kind of chucked their PhD thesis at you, or chucked an ethnography at you and said, off you go to China for a year and just you know, just get on with it, just do it. So there was no training. I mean, this was a while ago, you know, there was no training, there was no initiation, there was no framework, methodologically speaking, let's say. There was no kind of explicit, you know, attempts to make the method explicit to train a new generation of anthropologists. And so, of course, there are real downsides to that as well. So it's, how do you navigate that? You know, how do you navigate that line between not wanting to systematize something? I mean, when I write about sort of what I'm doing and present about it, I kind of I sort of say very much, you know, there isn't a single way, there is no unified approach, and you know, this is just a guide, a guiding framework, or some guiding questions, or which is I think, yeah, rather than pinning it down. I don't think that's necessarily all that helpful, although, you know, people can always, of course, innovate. Once you give something to somebody, they can innovate. So we have a question here. Can we understand Barad's quantum equilibrium as a seesaw of entanglements? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully understand the question either. What do you mean by the quantum equilibrium? I guess would be my question there. Yeah. If you want to say a bit more about that in the chat, what do you mean by the quantum equilibrium specifically? Okay. Other thoughts, questions, things that, here we go. I take equilibrium as a check balance. I'm not sure I can answer your question. But maybe we can. I mean, I'd have to think about that a bit more. It's a good question. Okay, so any other ideas, questions, suggestions for future workshops?
Well, I thought about something about, are you having another one? Yes, you have a third one.
I'm not having another one this year, but Alex has asked me to come back next year. So that's why I was thinking, oh, you know, what could I do differently if I did this again?
Well, I teach using workshop. I have been teaching using workshop since 10 years or so, or even more. And what I do is I take whoever's there and I see how many are we? We're 9, but that's a bit small, but usually it's anywhere from 15 to 50. And so I take a major theme, like for example, devise a methodology using Barad, you know, that will be a perfect theme. And then I would divide whoever is there into groups of minimally 3, but preferably 6, each one having a role, and give a theme that relates. For example, take the issue of objective-subjective could be one topic, issue of thinginess being another. There's plenty of concepts that you could ask for any one of them. And among the roles, you have a coordinator, somebody who makes sure that there is continuity in the work. It usually takes about 3 to 4 hours. So that's not the time you have now, but you could make that time later. And you ask one person, one of the member of the groups, to be a coordinator, and another one is going to be a producer. The producer is somebody who's going to make a presentation at the end of the discussion. You have a bunch of researchers, obviously. You have presenters. The reason giving roles is that gives people a sense of what they're doing into a group, instead of having a free-for-all where stuff sometimes work out very well because everybody's really nice and coherent and so on, but sometimes it doesn't go anywhere. And I think it's very valuable to have that. So you have all these roles, and each one has an element of the whole picture. Each one then presents their conclusions at the end of the whatever 4 hours you have. And you can either decide, well, it's good, we've got all these elements that we may actually do some further work on, or simply say, well, let's have another meeting next week or something, taking these and then turning them into a formal common presentation. And it's very successful because it gives the people who are participating both an objective and a role to play in it. And so the research can do all sorts of things. Go online and find information that coordinators and producers request images, for example, or pickled videos and so on. So you have a lot of activity, and I found that by and large it worked very well. The people who participated are very happy to do that. I teach this course. I'm teaching course on anthropology in Politecnico in Milano, and every year sometimes we make our presentation public because they're so focused and so polished that they actually can be presented to 100 people, and people are happy with it. But it's also a nice thing to ask the students to do, because then they are design students, right? So it's a course on anthropology for design. So it's a useful way of dealing with people especially in your case, you arrive here and you have all these people you don't really know personally, and so you have to get them involved in a very particular way. I learned that in Australia. at the RMIT, the Royal Military Information or whatever the name it was, technology. And it stung me. I thought it was absolutely brilliant way of dealing with a problem. Here I've got problem. Here are little pieces of it. Can you take care of that? Can you take care of this? So
yeah, that's a great idea, Derek.
I'll send you stuff if you want.
Yeah,
I can send,
sure.
I send you things that I've done with it, and it's a simple thing to explain and a simple thing to run.
Yeah.
And also, sometimes when you can, you invite experts. Like, for example, you have a whole lot of experts available right now this week to ask to just slip in their words about what it is that you're looking for. Particularly about this, I think this project is wonderful, wanting to get a methodology out of Karen Barad. I think it's absolutely pertinent. So I think you can do it.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I would say that I love this idea and very much interested. So I don't know if after this workshop, you will compile a list of participants or people who would like to continue to meet and talk and perhaps do precisely what Derek just described as like a follow-up workshop. I'd be very, very, very interested, especially since my dissertation work directly speaks to this very question of how do you develop a methodology around radical relationality. So sign me up wherever that's
right.
is.
Great, Lisette. Yeah, we'll try and make sure we have some means of maintaining in contact and continuing the conversation. Yeah, thank you. Good.
Actually, are we entitled to people's email and things like that?
I'm not sure. I think so. I mean, I Kelly might know. I don't know if Kelly's still with us. But I certainly I've got people's emails, or I've either got them, I was offered them. So I think, and yeah, but we can always ask Alex if people are prepared to share their details. But there
I literally just put mine in the chat just in case. That's like a very simple method.
I'll send you the stuff. I'm very interested. I'm not joking. I really am very interested. It's just that I haven't had enough time to really synthesize my thoughts about that. But picking up the most not convergent, the most interrelated concepts of Karen Barad to come up with something that we could just apply. We have, I don't know, we would have a situation of a political situation like the Gilets jaunes in France, for example, or the recent, turmoil in France after the murder of by a policeman of this young man. I mean, how do you apply Karen Barad's idea to study a political situation that has just exploded? And could you? And is there any reason to do it? And I think there is. And so it's very concrete. When I think about a methodology, it's like an anthropologist. I'm glad that Natasha and I are sharing that dimension, because anthropology does need to have some kind of guidelines. You have two ways of doing it, either on an armchair or being participating. And you were sent in China, you said, or did I get it wrong? Can't hear.
Sorry, I wasn't sent to China. No, it was the account I was reading was somebody who was. Yeah.
My favorite one was Jean Mallory, who was a very important anthropologist in France and was particularly interested in Africa. So at first he did all his anthropology thing and going to tribe and things, so on. And one day he said, this is ridiculous. So he invited all sorts of African people to study Paris. And you could see all these guys writing notes about, restaurants and shopping places and so on, shopping malls. And they wrote a very interesting anthropology because it did it partly with the training they had gotten, but also partly from stories and not so much methods, but ways of doing things from their own tribe. It's an experiment that I don't think has been repeated, but it was something quite exciting. And they had some training, but they also brought their own experience with them. I think
Great.
Barad, you're absolutely wonderful for this.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. I mean,
Do you have contact with her? I mean, do you know her?
yes, I have been in contact. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Galeb. Thank you so much. Yes, I met Barad in 2013 at a small conference in New York. Yeah, and then have been sort of sporadically in contact. Yeah. So
Would she be helpful with that? Would she enjoy it?
I think that possibly, but I've been involved with colleagues at trying to invite Barad to various.
I didn't get anywhere. No. And the person who recommended me to do it said, "Now watch out. She takes no prisoners."
Yeah, I think
difficult.
I think they there are a lot of invitations and a lot of requests, and it's hard to fit them in. And I think,
oh, I'm sure. I know.
Yeah. So, and in fact, the last time I was involved in trying to invite Barad, they, I think, fell and broke their wrist, or, there was, or leg. There was some kind of reason why it didn't work out. But yeah, we can keep trying.
Yeah,
we can keep trying. We can keep trying. So I think I'm going to wrap it up now. Because I think we've had a really interesting conversation. Thank you to those of you who've shared emails, and Kelly has confirmed in any case that we can share, that she's happy to pass on emails as long as people agree. So I think let's move on from this and try and create some kind of community of practice where we can perhaps have another event online. We can self-organize and build this community of practice, and have something where we pick up some of Derek's great ideas and do some collective work and brainstorming and thinking a little bit more about these questions. Lisette's very happy with that. I'm thrilled, because I think you're going to be a fantastic contributor. So that's brilliant. But I think I'll bring this session to a close, and I really want to thank you all for coming along. And Derek, I thank you for coming yesterday and today. That is commitment.
Sorry, it was always late, and I'm saying I'm having a really difficult time these days. But I'm so glad I was able to come, and I'm looking forward to continue. Now I see I have to write down, before you close, I want to write down the emails that people sent, because otherwise I won't have them. I can't just copy them. I don't know why. Ridiculous.
Yes, you can do, depending on what kind of computer you've got, you can do a screenshot.
Oh, yeah, but then easier if I just write it down.
Okay, so I'll let you do that before we close off. Yeah, thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much. This has been very, very generative, and I look forward to the next iteration.
Amazing. Thank you, Lisette. Thank you,
so
Scott, as well. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Natasha.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So have you got those written down?
I've got 3.
We had Lisette, Meryl, Galeb, and Scott.
So hey, and Scott.
Okay, so thank you, Kelly, as well. Thank you for being there in the background, making this possible, and for your support with the technology side. I really appreciated it.
No problem.
Okay, so
Okay, done it.
Great. Okay, Derek, that's great. So we'll keep in touch, and thank you very much again to everybody here, and enjoy the rest of the boot camp.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.